There's something about the cold that keeps secrets. Frozen earth, breathless silence. And in the winter of 1892, in the rural hills of Rhode Island, the ground was too hard to dig. So they waited. They waited to bury her, waited to mourn her, and they waited to see if she would rise. Because in Exeter, Rhode Island, something strange was happening. A family was dying, one by one, and no one could explain why. So they opened the grave, and inside they found a young woman, eerily preserved, her skin nearly untouched by death, blood still in her heart. And to the people standing there with torches and shovels, that was proof enough. Her name was Mercy Brown, and they burned her heart to stop her. This wasn't fiction. It wasn't Europe. It was New England, and it was a town caught in the grip of death, fear, and ritual. A place where reason gave way to folklore, where a daughter's memory was sacrificed for a brother's survival, and where the last vampire of America's most chilling panic was born. I'm your host, Robert Barber. Today's story takes us deep into the cold heart of 19th century Rhode Island, where a grave was opened, a heart was burned, and a legend was born. This is the story of Mercy Brown, and this is State of the Unknown. In the late 1800s, Exeter, Rhode Island was little more than a name on a map. A scattered farming village surrounded by dense woods and stony fields, where neighbors could live miles apart and still call each other close. The winters were long, the roads were dirt, and when the sky turned gray and the frost came early, the only thing more reliable than the cold was the silence. There were no hospitals, no electricity, no way to call for help in a hurry. When illness came, it came quietly, and it stayed. To live in Exeter in 1892 was to live with the knowledge that death could take a family in the span of a single season, and that's exactly what began to happen. The Brown family had lived in a modest farmhouse in the outskirts of town, ordinary, hardworking, private. By all accounts, they were no different than any other family in the area. But over the course of 10 years, something began to pick them off, one by one. Father George Brown lost his wife Mary in 1883. Then his eldest daughter, Mary Olive, in 1888. Both died slowly, weakening over weeks, then months before finally slipping away. And by early 1892, his only surviving son, Edwin, was dying too. His body was thin, his cough constant, his eyes hollowed out by fever. Today, we'd call that tuberculosis, an airborne disease that spread easily and killed slowly. But in 1892 Exeter, it didn't have a name like that. They called it the wasting sickness, or just a curse. Because the Brown family wasn't alone. Other families had suffered similar fates. Mothers, daughters, brothers, gone, one after another. And when the science failed, superstition filled the silence. Some said it was a shadow that passed from one house to the next. Others blamed bad air, bad spirits, or something even worse, something that fed, not on blood, but on breath, on warmth, on life itself. The Brown family lived on a small farm nestled at the edge of the woods. Not wealthy, not poor. Just one of the many families working the land to survive. George Brown, the father, was known as quiet and steady, a man of few words and long hours. He'd married Mary Eliza Brown in his early 20s, and together they had several children. Their life was hard, but not unhappy, and then, slowly, it began to unravel. In December of 1883, Mary Brown, the mother, fell ill. At first, it was just fatigue, then a persistent cough, and before long, she was bedridden. Neighbors recalled that she wasted away over the course of weeks. Her skin turned pale, almost bluish. Her breathing grew shallow, and then she was gone. The following years offered little rest. 5 years later, her daughter Mary Olive fell ill. She was only 20, a school teacher, bright, well-liked by students and neighbors alike. Her obituary described her as a loving and patient young woman whose kindness made her beloved by all who knew her. But even kindness couldn't protect her from the same shadow that took her mother. She began coughing blood, wasting away in her bed, and one night in 1888, she slipped into unconsciousness and never woke up. By the early 1890s, the only surviving children were Edwin and his younger sister Mercy. Edwin, once strong and hopeful, had moved west to Colorado in hopes that the dry air would restore his failing lungs. Doctors believed it might help, but it didn't. He returned to Rhode Island in early 1892, emaciated, weak, and barely able to walk. And when he stepped off the train, the news was already waiting for him. Mercy Lena Brown, his little sister, had died just a few weeks earlier. She had been the healthiest of them all, strong, sturdy, 19 years old. And yet she fell ill that winter, and within weeks, she was gone. She died on January 17, 1892. Her body was placed in a crypt, awaiting the spring thaw for burial. That left only Edwin, the last of the Brown children, and he was dying. George Brown had now buried his wife, 2 daughters, and was watching his only son fade in front of him. The town took notice. People began whispering. 4 deaths in the same family? Some said it was inherited. Others weren't so sure. Because Mercy had been strong, healthy even, until she wasn't. And then she died, just as Edwin began to worsen. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like cause and effect. Some believed that one of the dead wasn't truly gone, that someone, maybe Mercy, was draining Edwin's life to preserve her own. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as something darker. A vampire. And it wasn't just a theory whispered in corners. The fear was spreading. And in a town with more coffins than cures, there were some who believed that if George Brown didn't act, he might soon be burying another child. It's easy to laugh at the idea of vampires in New England, to imagine it as a fringe superstition, something out of old-world folk tales. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, across Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont, the fear was real, and the graves were open. This wasn't imported from Europe. It wasn't ancient Transylvanian myth creeping across the ocean. This panic, this ritual of digging up the dead, was homegrown. And it was deadly serious. Between the mid-1700s and late 1800s, dozens of exhumations were documented across New England. They followed the same pattern. One family member would die, then another, then another. When the sickness wouldn't stop, they looked for answers in the ground. In Griswold, Connecticut, a family dug up multiple relatives in a panic after a string of deaths. In Manchester, Vermont in 1817, a man named Frederick Ransom was exhumed and burned by his own father, who believed he was feeding on his siblings from the grave. Some of these rituals were led by ministers, others by doctors. They were public, communal, accepted. Because what these communities feared wasn't just death. It was the slow death, the creeping kind. The kind that took your daughter in the spring, your son in fall, and your wife by the end of the year. The kind that medicine wouldn't stop, that left no wound, no explanation. And nowhere was that fear more present than in tuberculosis, or as they called it then, consumption. Tuberculosis was ruthless. It moved slowly, invisibly. You could carry it for years before it took hold. And once it did, it was like watching someone fade in slow motion. The symptoms read like a gothic horror story: pale, waxy skin, eyes sunken into the skull, coughing blood, night sweats, weight loss, the body wasting away. To the people of Exeter, it didn't feel like disease. It felt like something feeding. And in a time when most rural families live far from cities, without doctors, without microscopes, and without a modern understanding of germs, the invisible had to be made visible. So they gave it a face, and a name, and a cure. If you believed a dead relative was feeding on the living, there was only one way to stop them: dig up the body, examine the corpse for signs of life like the absence of decay, fresh blood, hair, or nail growth. If you saw that, then you removed and burned the heart, sometimes the liver too, mix the ashes into a tonic, and then give that tonic to the sick. It sounds horrifying now, and it was. But for families who had buried one child and were watching another fade, it felt like a small price to pay for hope. This wasn't done in secret. It was done in cemeteries, in clearing daylight, with neighbors watching. It was folklore turned into action, desperation turned into ritual. And in March of 1892, after losing 3 members of his family, George Brown agreed. He gave permission to open the graves of his wife and daughters, because the only thing more terrifying than disturbing the dead was letting the living keep dying. And what they found when they opened Mercy Brown's coffin was something no one expected. March 17th, 1892, just after sunrise. The air was sharp, still holding the chill of winter. And in the Chestnut Hill Cemetery of Exeter, Rhode Island, the ground was cold, but soft enough to dig. A small group of men arrived in silence, among them George Brown, father of the dead, Dr. Harold Metcalf, a respected physician from nearby Wickford, several neighbors and townsfolk, some who had helped carry Mercy's coffin weeks earlier. And behind the trees, just beyond the cemetery fence, a small crowd gathered, curious, suspicious, some horrified, some hoping to see proof of the impossible. They brought shovels, lanterns, a coffin key, and a fire already smoldering on the edge of the field. They weren't there to pay respects. They were there for evidence of something still feeding. They started with the older graves. Mary Brown, the mother, had been dead for nearly a decade. Her coffin, when unearthed, was collapsed inward. The remains inside were skeletal as expected: bones, discolored cloth, and not much more. Then came Mary Olive, dead 4 years. Same result, nothing out of the ordinary. But Mercy was different. She had died only 8 weeks earlier, on January 17th. But her body hadn't been buried in the ground because the earth was too frozen. Instead, she had been placed inside an above-ground stone crypt, kept cold and dry, awaiting spring. To the men gathered that morning, the storage location was practical. To the crowd watching, it was ominous. When they opened the crypt and pried off the coffin lid, what they saw shocked them. Mercy's body showed almost no decomposition. Her skin was intact. Her hair appeared to have grown, her nails too. Most damning of all, when Dr. Metcalf made an incision and opened her chest cavity, he found liquid blood still pooled in her heart and liver. To modern science, it makes sense. Cold storage, no exposure to elements, natural post-mortem changes. But to the people standing there, wrapped in coats in fear, it was something else entirely. It was confirmation. Mercy Brown wasn't truly dead. She was still feeding. Her heart was removed, so was her liver. They were placed on a flat rock nearby, likely one still visible in the cemetery today. The organs were burned, charred down to ash. And from that ash, they made a tonic, a bitter black mixture combined with water or even perhaps wine. It was then given to Edwin Brown, Mercy's dying brother. It was supposed to save him, to stop the feeding, to break the curse. It didn't work. Edwin Brown died just 2 months later in May of 1892. He was buried next to Mercy. The last child of George Brown was gone, and the ritual, desperate and gruesome as it was, had failed. But Mercy's story, her story, didn't die with him. It had only just begun to spread. Edwin Brown died in the spring of 1892, just weeks after the ritual meant to save him. The Brown farmhouse fell silent. No more coughing, no more crying. Just a hollow house tucked in the wooded hills of Exeter. George Brown, who had now buried his wife and all of his children, returned to his farm and faded into quiet grief. He would live another 17 years alone. But outside of Exeter, people were just starting to hear Mercy's name because someone had been watching. A reporter from the Providence Journal had witnessed the exhumation firsthand. He took notes, interviewed neighbors, and described what he saw in vivid detail. And just days later, the headline ran, "Exhumation of Mercy Brown, a Vampire in Exeter." That single article set off a storm. Within a week, the story had been picked up by the Boston Globe, then by newspapers in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and even London. Each retelling grew stranger, more sensational. Details blurred, but the core remained. A girl, dead but not decayed. A heart, burned. A town, gripped by fear. Some called her the last American vampire. Others, the girl who wouldn't stay dead. Editors leaned into the drama, drawing comparisons to medieval Europe and Romanian folklore. Cartoons depicted gaunt girls rising from graves. Sensationalists warned that rural Americans were slipping back into superstition. And yet the public couldn't get enough. Because there was something hauntingly modern about it. This wasn't ancient history. It had happened in 1892, just a few years before the automobile was invented, at a time when germ theory was already spreading in cities, when electric streetlights were flickering on in Boston and New York. How could this have happened now? The question captivated readers, and in time, it reached one reader who would change the course of vampire lore forever. In London, a young Irish writer named Bram Stoker was hard at work on a new novel. A novel about a pale, undead nobleman from the East, a creature who drained life, crossed oceans, and slept in the dirt of a foreign land. That novel would be called Dracula, and it would be published in 1897, just 5 years after the exhumation of Mercy Brown. Scholars believe that Stoker was directly influenced by American vampire folklore and Mercy's case in particular. He had friends in journalism. He followed transatlantic news, and the Providence Journal article was one of several clippings preserved in his notes. The similarities are uncanny. A beautiful young woman, pale and recently dead, suspected of feeding on family from beyond the grave, and ultimately destroyed to save the living. There's no definitive proof Mercy was the inspiration for Lucy Westenra, Dracula's first victim in the novel, but the timing is hard to ignore. And if nothing else, her story helped shape the modern image of the vampire, not as a monstrous peasant, but as something closer, more intimate, more tragic. Mercy Brown's name may not appear in Dracula, but her shadow lingers there, and her legend, once whispered in graveyards and farmhouses, was now immortalized in one of the most influential horror novels of all time, from rural Rhode Island to the world. To understand why Mercy Brown's story became what it did, you have to understand what was really killing people, not just in Exeter, but across New England. Tuberculosis. Back then, they called it consumption. It wasn't sudden. It didn't come with rashes or violence. It came with silence. a slow erasure of the body. The symptoms felt almost supernatural. The skin would turn pale, the eyes would darken and sink into the skull, coughing fits would bring up blood, the breath would grow shallow, and night after night you'd hear them gasping in their sleep. Sometimes a person would waste away over a year, sometimes just a few weeks. And once it entered a household, it didn't stop at one person. Families watched as it passed from one child to the next, leaving parents helpless, doctors baffled, and entire communities paralyzed with dread. Today, we know that tuberculosis is a bacterial infection spread through the air, often exacerbated by malnutrition, close quarters, and poor sanitation. But in the 1800s, germ theory was still new. In rural areas, it hadn't taken hold. Doctors had little more than guesswork, treatment was inconsistent, and cures non-existent. So when the disease struck, especially repeatedly in the same household, people needed an explanation. And in the absence of science, they turned to story. They gave the sickness a face. They gave it intent. They turned it into a vampire. But this wasn't Dracula. This wasn't a castle-dwelling count in velvet robes. The vampire they feared wasn't foreign, it wasn't elegant, it wasn't even alive. It was someone they had loved, someone they had buried, a relative, a child, a sibling, a spouse, someone who had died and yet, in death, was still reaching back. This kind of vampire didn't drink blood through fangs. It didn't seduce or stalk. It was more insidious, more emotional. It was thought to drain life spiritually, feeding on the vitality of its closest kin, even from beyond the grave. It was grief given shape, loss made personal. The belief wasn't rooted in ancient legend. It was born in New England soil, in cold crypts, in quiet bedrooms where children wasted away while their parents prayed for answers. And the rituals, grisly as they sound, weren't born out of cruelty. They were acts of desperation, a last attempt to make sense of the senseless, to do something, anything, before the sickness claimed one more life. That's what happened in Exeter. That's what happened to Mercy. And while she wasn't the first person exhumed in New England, she would become the last known case and the most famous. Because by 1892, the world was changing. Medicine was evolving. Beliefs were shifting. And soon, no one would admit they ever believed it all. So what was it, really? Was it a rural panic? A tragic misunderstanding of disease? Or something darker? Something about grief, fear, and what we do when we're desperate? The story of Mercy Brown doesn't end with the grave. It lingers. Not just because it was shocking, but because it taps into something deeply human. Anthropologists argue that stories like Mercy's aren't just superstition. They're a kind of psychological first aid. When science fails, when death feels random, when the body count climbs, we look for meaning, for pattern, for cause. In a world without answers, a vampire is oddly comforting. A vampire can be stopped. A vampire has a face. A vampire gives us reason for the suffering. Tuberculosis? That was invisible, hopeless. It stole children in their sleep, and no amount of praying, pleading, or doctoring could stop it. But if you could burn the heart, maybe you could burn the curse. It sounds irrational now, but it was agency, control, a final act of resistance against a disease that felt like a monster in its own right. And while the science has long since caught up, the story hasn't faded. Mercy Brown's tale has become part of America's darker folklore canon. She's inspired books, including fiction, academic texts, and medical histories, TV episodes from Lore to Mysteries at the Museum to Kindred Spirits, documentaries, podcasts, and even a folk opera, and most notably, years of debate over her influence on Dracula. Her grave still stands in Chestnut Hill Cemetery, a small, simple marker. People visit from all over the world. They leave coins, roses, notes asking for protection or answers. Some leave vials of blood. Others, small figures carved from twigs. Even now, over a century later, she draws pilgrims of the paranormal. Locals say that the woods nearby are never fully quiet, that strange chills pass through even on warm days, that birdsong stops near her grave. Is it just the power of suggestion or something else? That's the thing with stories like Mercy's. They don't end. They echo. Whether she was a scapegoat, a symbol, or just a girl caught up in the wrong moment in history, Mercy Brown became America's most famous vampire. Not because she was one, but because so many people needed her to be one. Mercy Brown wasn't a monster. She wasn't a creature of the night. She wasn't even sick for very long. She was a teenager, a daughter, a sister, a girl who died in the wrong place at the wrong time during the wrong kind of fear. But in death, she became something more, a symbol, a scapegoat, a legend. And that's what makes her story so chilling, because it isn't just about vampires. It's about us. It's about what people do when they're drowning in grief, when the world stops making sense, when they lose everything and there's no one left to blame but the dead. Today we have answers. We understand tuberculosis. We understand decomposition and why hair and nails appear to grow after death. We know why blood can pool in the heart of a body kept in the cold. But back then, none of that mattered. What mattered was the ache, the empty chair at the table, the third coffin in one family. So they made the fear visible, and they burned it. Maybe that's why people still visit her grave, to try and understand her, to mourn her, to connect with a story that feels like something out of myth, but was written in real names, in real death, and real winter air. Because whether she was a victim of disease, of folklore, or of both, Mercy Brown reminds us of something uncomfortable, that the darkest monsters are often the ones we create ourselves. This is State of the Unknown. Every other week, we travel to another corner of America, uncovering the haunted highways, hidden legends, and untold stories that refuse to stay buried. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow, share, and leave a review. And if you're ever in Exeter, Rhode Island, bring a flower. Not for the vampire, but for the girl who never asked to become one.